Okay, we will give it just a minute and allow folks to connect to audio. If you could please mute yourself. Great, wonderful. All right, everyone, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We have Ashu here, who is a second year in the MSPH program focusing on HPM. He is working currently at Charles River Associates and is going to talk to us a little bit more about what it's like to work for CRA and specifically more about life sciences consulting. So with that, Ashu, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. It's glad to be speaking to Hopkins students again. So yes, part of my program, and I'll give a brief introduction here. Part of my program, so I'm a second year MSPH student. So the second year for me is a full year field placement. And for me, I've gone back into consulting, and I'll give you kind of a intro to my journey in a second. But just as a quick housekeeping note, this meeting is, I guess, meant to be helpful to you. So feel free to jump on and like raise your hand or unmute for any questions. I'm here as a second year student, not an official CRA rep. And so the goal here is really to just familiarize you with what consulting could be and life science consulting especially. And then I can give you details on CRA as well. We have some applications coming up and we're starting some recruitment activities there. So with that, I can go ahead and get started. This is me on the slide. I am an associate at the New York City Life Science Practice. I'm living in Brooklyn right now. I have about 2 years of consulting experience between CRA a few months here and then IQVIA, another consulting firm, some time ago. My primary fields of focus are public health, rare disease, oncology, payment reform, and then innovation policy. And yeah, I can give a journey here, overview of my journey here. So I'm from Newark, Delaware, small town right by the University of Delaware, great place to grow up. I did my undergraduate studies at the University of Pennsylvania, where I studied health policy and law, and from an undergraduate perspective, and then political science as well. So I've always had this policy focus. I worked for about a year and a half at IQVIA over in Boston. There I worked mostly on commercial strategy projects and some pricing and market access projects as well. And then I took a hiatus from work to then go back to school. I did my MSPH my first year at Hopkins, and now I'm doing my second year field placement. While I was at Hopkins, through my program and through my classes, I was able to focus on two main areas. So behavior change interventions and pharmaceutical policy. I've been able to combine the two in kind of all the passions that I pursue. One of them being the work that I do with Charles River Associates as a consultant, but I also have several passion projects that I do for humanitarian interventions through a nonprofit that I started with my sister, where we help refugees integrate into their new host countries. That's a little bit about me. What I'll do now is give an intro on what is life science consulting for anyone who is new to the area, as well as kind of giving a pitch for why it's interesting. So what is consulting? Very broad question. I found a half decent definition here from consultancy.eu. Consulting is defined as the practice of providing a third party with expertise on a matter in exchange for a fee. The service may involve either advisory or implementation services. I think some key terms here is that we're providing expertise for a fee. So the client has to be someone who's able to pay a fee. And then the types of services are typically advisory or implementation services. I'll get into that in a second. I guess in healthcare consulting, there's so many consulting firms out there, but it's really broken down by who do you help and how do you help them. So the who do you help, it can be anyone. It can be, again, anyone who can pay, which means often it's going to be organizations and not individuals. So organizations include payers, so insurance companies, providers, which include hospitals and physician groups, governments and government agencies, so state governments and then federal agencies, as well as nonprofits including places like the Gates Foundation, rare disease organizations, and patient advocacy groups. There's pharmaceutical and biotech companies themselves. And then there's healthcare finance companies, or just finance companies investing in healthcare, in the healthcare space. These include venture capital firms and private equity firms. And so when I say that I work in life science consulting, and when most people say life science consulting, they typically mean primarily pharmaceutical and biotech companies as their clients. I would say most companies, like the overwhelming majority. My company at CRA, we work a little bit more with nonprofits than your average life science consulting firm because we have a policy sector. And then there are some life sciences firms that do almost exclusively finance. So it's a little misleading to just look at this broad swath of life science consulting firms as homogenous. There is a fair amount of variety in between them. And so it's worth your time to look into the websites as you're applying to make sure that it fits with your expectations and what you're interested in. And then the question is, how do you help them? The next question. So there's two ways you can help them. This is drawing on the slide from before. You can help companies and groups adopt a strategic decision-making approach based off of some form of research, or you can help them actually implement and execute on decisions. They tend to be, the companies that provide these different services tend to be discrete. So my company, CRA, predominantly focuses on decision-making support. And then, and that can be decision-making support to help someone else, to help that company execute on their vision, or just even to plan what their vision could be. So it can happen at different levels. But then what I mean by implementation is, like, there are consulting firms that will literally be contracted out by the government, for example, to actually like host services themselves. Like the people who made healthcare.gov, that was a consulting firm that made that. So what is life science consulting and why is it interesting? Rather than bore you with all the descriptors, I figured I'd just go through some projects that I've worked on recently and some of the ones that I've worked on in the past. Recently, I've been working on a lot of policy projects, given my trajectory out of the HPM program. And so the first one here is, this is what I'm working on now. Patients with rare diseases take 5 to 8 years on average to be diagnosed, even for diseases where there are existing drugs. How can a pharma company help advocate for a change in policies that improve rare disease diagnostic testing? That's a fun project. Another one is new drugs that reduce obesity more effectively than bariatric surgery are about to receive FDA approval. So it's super effective, you avoid surgery, but they're viewed as lifestyle drugs right now. And so they're not widely reimbursed. So what happens to patients who really need this drug to have press the reset button on their obesity and start fresh, but they're not getting reimbursed for it? So what happens? How can a pharma company improve access for patients? And another one, this is more recent with the times, is that the Inflation Reduction Act passed by Congress this past summer and signed into law. It collects a rebate. One of the many provisions that it has is that it collects a rebate or a financial penalty for any revenue driven by drug prices that increase faster than inflation. In concept, it sounds great, like drug prices shouldn't increase faster than inflation. But what will be the financial impact to a large pharma company from this? And how should they adjust their pricing strategy? What does it actually mean for them in practice? So the policy world that I work in is policy projects that I get to work on are a bit of like prospective thinking ones, like how can we change the landscape? And then it's response. How do we respond to policies? And then, I'll mute that person. There's also a few commercial strategy ones. I can go over these and then just take a pause to see if anyone has questions. So one that I've worked on recently is that a company is interested in making a drug treating heart failure, but needs to know what the current patient flow or journey looks like to best be able to target the unmet need. So the question that I'm helping answer is, how can we use patient claims data to give an overview to that company to understand what the heck happens with heart failure? Another one is that a biotech company is making an all-in-one blood test to screen patients for a variety of cancers. this is a screening mechanism, so a screening test. So it's targeted for primary care physicians, but they don't know how to interpret the cancer diagnostic results. So how do you change the way that they're displayed so that PCPs can actually take clinical action from these from the test results? So this is like an example of some projects that I'm working on now or recently. I'm not going to go into all of these, but these are past projects. One of my favorite ones is the first one here. How should a company with a potential HIV vaccine candidate approach its global commercial launch, and which countries should it enter first and how? That was super fun. Got to look at like 20 countries in scope and see like how to approach different regions of the world, especially like the Middle East, where for an HIV vaccine, even getting diagnosed with HIV is so stigmatizing. People can go to prison through that process alone. So how do you break into those markets and change the landscape? Some investment ones here as well. Should a private equity company invest in a digital therapeutics company? And if so, how? And how should they steer them? Another one, rare disease drugs coming out. How can a company get patients to start seeing their doctors again when they've like foregone going to the doctor because there's never been a treatment? So these are the kinds of projects that I've gotten to work on. I consider myself very lucky, but I also think that this is pretty run of the mill for the types of projects you might see in consulting. So this is, I guess, my pitch to you to say this is interesting stuff. And I hope you find it interesting too. I'll pause there to see if you have any questions just on some of the stuff that I've talked about so far.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing those examples. I feel like those are really interesting, but I also have this question. So those are sounds very like commercial or market focused, but without a business background, is that like really hard for like a MPH student to get hands-on experience with those?
Great question. So for context, I did not have a business background going into consulting for the first time. I had a political science background and a history background more than anything else. And I think the way that I would describe that transition, you can focus on the skills that you'll end up using in practice and the knowledge that you'll need. So skills include things like qualitative interviews. I have a slide on this, actually. Let me try to find that. Excuse me while I jump to it. Okay, yeah. We do a lot of secondary research, which I'm sure you're all used to doing. Literature reviews, looking at analyst reports is more financing stuff. We don't do that much, but literature reviews for the most part, and looking at academic literature and grade literature. Everything that you've been trained to do up until now in your lives. Primary market research. So a lot of that is interviewing people, interviewing doctors, patients to see what their lives are like, what their work is like. We interview some academics as well, and you all talk to professors every day. So you're used to that. There's other forms of primary market research too, like surveys and like ad board. I don't even know what an ad board is. Surveys are common. A lot of data analytics. So you're taking biostats right now. Going to be super helpful. Modeling is just a fancy way to say we do math on Excel that links one calculation to the next. It's not complicated. And then, yeah, analyzing claims. So if you have a particularly strong analytics background, if you're really well trained in this data or something, you can really dig deep on the claim side of things to drive projects, to drive certain types of projects. The rest of it is just talking to people, like client collaboration, being presentable, being able to talk someone through a presentation, things like that, being able to do things on PowerPoint. It's shockingly not as complex as it sounds for some from the outside. And so I'd encourage you to not think of, not be discouraged by any of the corporate lingo that's thrown in a lot of these applications. It is definitely very doable, and you've all been trained to do this kind of stuff. Yes, another question?
Hi. So my question is that, like someone mentioned that it's a lot of like commercial focus and market focus. Are there any specific like courses that you'd recommend at Hopkins that would help you develop those? Because like apart from these things that you mentioned, yeah, we do get a bunch of that. But like, is there something in HPM, or is there anything you specifically took that helped you?
Yeah. And I guess this is, I gave a little bit of an incomplete answer to the last one. So I talked about skills a lot. There's also knowledge that I've thrown in this box here. Just general industry knowledge is helpful. So I would recommend following the news about the industry to see what's happening. It's the best way to stay up to date. No class will tell you exactly what's happening in the news. So that's something on you. Would highly recommend the pharmaceutical policy class with Dr. Sokal. That was a great overview, especially breaking down certain terms like different types of drug pricing. It's list pricing, net pricing, all this weird niche stuff that happens in the drug space that policy can really help break down. That class can really help break down. Any of the health economics classes and HEOR classes, I didn't take the HEOR ones, but the health economics ones for sure definitely give you a sense of how the market can react to certain changes. And it helps you keep a big picture view when you're giving consulting advice to companies. And then anything disease specific. So if you have a medical background or any healthcare background or any research background in STEM or something, that all actually counts a lot towards your ability to understand any new project and make recommendations. And the last class here is the Intro to the US Health System class. I think it's offered first term and sometime later as well. Just a great overview class. I see two other questions. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
Okay.
If you guys okay with that.
Sure, go for it.
Okay. I asked this in the chat, but basically I'm an MMI student, so I wanted to know if someone with like a more technical science background could transition smoothly into this field, because like I see that this requires a lot more like marketing, research, and policy. So I wanted to know, how could someone like me transition?
Great question. MMI, could you explain what that is?
Oh, molecular microbiology and immunology is in the public health.
Yeah, great. So for context, I mean, drugs are either chemicals or biological entities. So to be able to understand what a drug is, how it works, the mechanism of action behind it, the route of administration, like all of the things that go into it, it is all helpful information. A lot of the people I actually work with they have like PhDs in chemical engineering or something, and like come in from that background, like a science background entirely.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Huda, do you have a question as well?
Yeah. First, I just want to say thank you for breaking this down like you did. I think it's really helpful to know like what exact skills you like use to do this work. My question is, your like initial questions were really those were big like questions and hard to answer. And I know you said that, you know, you use skills like literature reviews and interviews and simple analytics to answer those. But my question is, when you reach a recommendation, like how close are you to answering the questions and like these big questions that like some of these are huge, like big questions and like big problems to answer. And how much do you think creativity like applies to this? Because I don't find myself to be a very creative person, but I feel like these need creative solutions. So yeah.
Yeah. I would say, okay, first of all, I wouldn't say that you're not a creative person. I think everyone's creative to some regard. I wouldn't discount yourself there. These questions, they really are questions that no one has answered before. And I think that's the really interesting stuff about it, the really interesting part about it. For example, this first one, that's my favorite project that I've ever worked on, like the launch of the HIV vaccine. The question was like, first of all, how do you narrow down which countries to go into, right? That's a question. And then you answer, once you can figure out which, you know, you find certain metrics to judge that off of, whether it's the population size, how burdensome HIV is in that country, what the, I don't know, what the vaccine infrastructure looks like, you know, do they have like mandatory adult vaccines or is it just pediatric? You can start breaking things down question by question to start answering this much bigger question. If that's helpful. You can almost think of it like a pyramid. You have this one big question at the top, you break it down into, say, 3 parts. You break those into 3 more parts. You break that into 3 more parts. And so once it's all said and done, you really have all of the inputs necessary to answer the big question.
That is super helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, totally.
Ashu, there was one more question in the chat. I'm happy to read it out.
Sure.
So Jenny says, do we have to be demonstrating our skills at this point and in what form? So I'm assuming she's talking about like as a student, how would you demonstrate that you have these skills?
Totally. Let's see. Involvement in, okay, so number one thing people will look for when they're reviewing applications is, does this person have an interest in this field? Because so many people apply and they're like, they're applying for the wrong thing. And I say that and you think it's ridiculous, but like people will apply to it can be something as niche as, you could be really interested in venture capital, and if you apply to CRA, you won't get the job because CRA doesn't do venture capital or doesn't do a lot of it. So it can come down to some niche things like that, but really identifying what you're interested in. And usually you probably have a track record of doing something along those lines, whether it's taking classes at a minimum in that area, getting involved in some sort of research or extracurricular activity in that area, volunteering in that area. I know there's like patient advocacy, like literally if you have nothing else to do, reach out to your local patient advocacy group and see how you can help. Like I've done that with other organizations, like other NGOs, and people accept free help. So if you're in a position to just like offer time, you're an MPH student or a master's student or graduate student at Hopkins, you have a lot to offer to an organization for free. And that is experience for you that you can use to get a job. You'd be shocked how far that can take you. So I guess that's my kind of advice to someone who has like no experience at all. You leverage your classes, leverage your skills, and find opportunities for yourself right now, because you probably can find something. You got a whole year ahead of you to do stuff. And I can get in the timeline later, but I would encourage you to do that regardless of whether you could end up pursuing consulting or not, just because it's going to be fun and interesting.
Thanks, Ashu. There are a few more questions, so I don't know if you want to keep going with your presentation and come back to Q&A at the end, or if you want to take those questions now.
Yeah, I can. Sorry, coming back from a cold. I can cover a couple other parts.
Okay, great.
But then come back. Yeah. And I can share these slides too, so that if anyone wants to look at these questions, I know like this case interviews, there's not that many cases out there, practice cases, that I find it helpful. I just think it's helpful to think about these types of questions, and then it's just, if you can start to answer, come up with a way to answer these questions, it's good case prep too. Okay, my spiel about CRA. So I'm not here as an official advocate for CRA or official representative, so spare me with the recruitment questions about like, can I give you a recommendation or not? Or like, can I like get you an in? But overview of CRA in general, and I can kind of compare and contrast other life science firms as well. So CRA in this case is a generalist firm with a dedicated life science practice. What that means is they do a little bit of everything. CRA's main focus happens to actually be in litigation. Surprisingly enough, they do a lot of like antitrust and competition related things. So it's actually an economic consulting firm that uses economics as an approach to tackle a lot of different problems. Life sciences happens to be a good industry where you can use economics to tackle those problems. Another like vertical that we have is energy. So everything else kind of like is cross industry, except for energy and life sciences, which are kind of their own standalone industries, and they have a lot of services within them. Overview of CRA, there's 200 plus life science consultants, over 22 global offices. And when they say global office, there's actually a decent amount across Europe, and mostly Europe and the US. So it is a fair amount. Like I have projects with European counterparts, and it's fun, aside from the early mornings. There's a lot of there's different types of offerings. So they have strategy projects, policy projects, and litigation projects are their main focuses. And I'll get into those in a little bit. They have certain focus areas. So oncology, rare diseases, immunology, neuroscience, specialty biopharma. Pretty much all of this is actually specialty biopharma. And I'm just being honest with you, it's because biologic products have the highest revenue. And so those teams and companies can often afford high-end consultants a lot more often. So it just happens to be the people who have enough money to regularly afford consultants, and those end up being the types of projects we see. That also includes like gene and cell therapies every now and then. Vaccine make a lot of revenue, so those actually get involved in they also get a lot of consultants. There's a client first philosophy. There's an interesting thing that I don't know how much this belongs actually here, but there's an interesting thing I know about CRA culture, and that they teach us that you should treat everyone like a consultant, everyone like a client, which is really nice because it makes teamwork really nice. And there's hands-on senior leadership. And then average VPs and seniors have a lot of experience, which is actually really nice because you're in a small team with 5 people or 6 people for the most part. And to have someone, giving advice and guidance who has so much expertise in the area, it's really helpful. Especially if you find your niche and I'm working on policy projects, and the person who leads most of the US policy projects is like on retainer by AEI and a bunch of think tanks because of her expertise in global pharma policy. So she's super cool and great to have as like a guide and a mentor. We help a lot of life sciences clients solve challenging strategic problems. Just an array of all the big pharma companies and organizations we've helped work with. I'll say on top of this, there's a fair amount of nonprofits like the Gates Foundation, rare disease organizations as well, especially in the policy sphere. I see those types of projects a fair bit. So those have been interesting. And then some biotech clients as well. So like med devices, the diagnostic companies as well. So it's a lot of interesting stuff going on. These are the 3 areas of focus within life sciences consulting at CRA. Strategy, which is navigating complex questions through relevant insights, rigorous analytics, and industry expertise. All that is to say, we help people answer really difficult questions about whatever they have going on in their lives. Strategy is a really big catch-all bucket, which can be broken down into these subparts. There's investment decisions. So CRA doesn't do too much of investment stuff, but a lot of other companies do. I know LEK, for instance, almost focuses exclusively on private equity deals in their life sciences group. And they'll still call it life sciences general consulting. But it's a bit tricky to figure out when you're applying. There's investments, there's R&D, there's commercial strategy. So how do you bring drugs into different markets? And then there's also pricing and market access. There's basically, to answer any of these commercial strategy questions and these types of projects, we do like all types of research, but mostly market research. So market research includes interviewing people who are experts, interviewing patients and so on to get insights, and also advanced analytics. So understanding claims data or sales data for other products that are similar. Jumping back to this slide, the other areas of focus are litigation and policy. Litigation ends up being, so CRA is an economic consulting firm, which is helpful to keep in mind when you're thinking about litigation, because when all of these opioid companies are getting sued by the governments and state governments, ultimately someone has to decide how much they owe. And that's where economic consulting comes in to find the dollar amount. There's also like cases against, Johnson & Johnson baby powder. There can be cases between companies if there's like patent litigation. I don't do too much of litigation, and I'll be frank, litigation is kind of a niche specialty area. So if that's your wheelhouse, CRA has it, but it's not required for you to be working in that area to be able to join. What I'll say, and there's policy projects, which I can answer plenty of questions about because I love that stuff. But really anticipating, analyzing, and responding to policy challenges. So I've listed these 3 areas that CRA does. There are other companies that do other things as well. So IQVIA, the company that I worked at before, has a lot of patient data. And so they will do like data consulting to basically tell companies, oh, how can you use data and leverage our data sources on patient claims, pharmaceutical sales, or whatever, to answer some of your business questions. They even do like more R&D related specialties. They do, what else? Oh, patient-centered outcomes research. That's the subfield. So there's a broad variety of consulting firms. This happens to be the area that CRA focuses on. If you have questions on other types too, I'd encourage you to just Google and look, or start talking to other people in different consulting firms, because they'll tell you kind of how they're structured. I'm not going to go into this. Okay, 2 more slides and then I'll take more questions. So we kind of covered this already, but CRA, like consulting in general, I think builds on a lot of skills that you develop in academia and through education. So you can see the graphic here, but it's really like so many transferable skills, and the terminology is going to be different in the business world. But at the end of the day, you're taking those skills that you already have and just applying them to business problems. And from a public health perspective, a lot of those business problems also end up being public health problems, which is really interesting to be able to work on. For example, some of the policy projects of increasing access to certain treatments or diagnostics, public health problems. How do you launch a new vaccine or a rare disease drug in different countries? A public health problem. So there's a lot of interesting overlaps that you'll see, especially coming from your background in public health. And then lastly, my last bit on consulting and why it's interesting and a great place to start your career is because it allows you to grow within the company. There's a lot of room to grow. There's almost like this set trajectory of like levels that you can go through as the years go on, as you gain more experience, which means that there's a lot, like, you know what's coming next. There's not a lot of uncertainty, but your responsibilities will change at each level. And it's a great way to learn to take on more responsibilities so that you can eventually, if you want, exit and enter like industry jobs, consult for, or like enter into any other field, and you suddenly come in with a broad variety of experience. The other thing I'll say about consulting generally is that because you're not tied to a single company and you're working with so many companies on their most pressing problems, you develop a very good big picture of what's happening in the world and a great idea of the landscape, so that when you go do something after, you know you're an expert on that field. That's really nice. It's so nice to be able to like sit and like see what what's keeping everyone up at night, because that in and of itself is very instructive. And lastly, if nothing else, it's having consulting on your resume at any point means it's a verification to anyone else that, okay, this person is business savvy and can hold their own in a work environment. So that level of just basic accreditation and reputation is helpful as well. The next section is about sorry, how to prepare and apply for these types of jobs. We covered a few topics as well already, but I want to pause here and cover any questions that people have had. I know there's some in the chat, but yeah, happy to take any questions right now. Yeah, Julia.
Sorry. Hi, I'm like in a doctor's office right now, so excuse me. I was wondering, since you like work with a lot of pharmaceutical companies, have you ever had to like do anything that was like bioethically kind of like very nuanced, and how do you navigate that?
Yeah. Without going too deep into my trauma, I actually quit my last job because of a bioethical problem. It was a pricing project, and this is why I don't like pricing projects. But essentially what had happened was our research was saying that this new drug should be priced at around $120,000 a year per patient, which is on par with all the other late stage cancer drugs in that class. The company turns around and says, we're gonna ignore that and price it at 300,000. So like over double. And they come back, and then I had people within my old company's team say, like, we need to somehow make our data reflect this. And when you're in that position as someone who is bioethically conscious, there's two impulses. You can either run or you can stay and fight. And running is easy. And I like think about that now a lot, of what I could do different. It's a hard thing to take on when you're young and you're like in your like early 20s, just getting started. That's a heavy burden to take on. However, if it's not you, who else is it going to be? And I think that's where it kind of boils down to, like, no matter what field you're entering, you will face bioethically like contentious decisions. Whether, and pharma is something where I think public health gives pharma a pretty bad rep for this. And I will say it's predominantly because of pricing. And that's pricing in the US, actually, not most other countries. But if it's not you, who else is it going to be? And I think if you keep that in mind, it'll be your guiding compass to stay strong in situations where you are ethically pushed. Great question. Others?
Ashu, we had a few in the chat from a while back, so I'll just read one of the ones that hasn't been answered yet. So Ian asked, how do you find experts to interview? He said, I found some firms to cold call, email. Is there a standard in the industry, or do you have to have contacts from other organizations or in other organizations from CRA?
I guess is the question directed towards like, while we're doing research, how do we find the experts interview? Or is it more about if you're interested in getting involved in consulting, how do you find people?
Ian, could you clarify your question maybe in the chat if you're not able to unmute? While doing research, he says.
While doing research? Okay, good question. So it depends on the consulting firm that you join and the type of project. And the reason why I say that is there are consulting firms, 2 consulting firms that specialize in just finding experts, and they're great. So if you work for a relatively big consulting firm, like CRA is decently sized, we can afford to have a partnership with that expert finding consulting firm. And every time we have a project, we basically develop a screening criteria, saying like, this person needs to be a specialist in this field, has to have worked for this long, needs to be academically affiliated, but still has like, at least 30% of their time dedicated to patients. We have screening criteria like that. We hand it off to the expert finders, and they find us a bunch of experts, and then we say yes or no on whether we want to interview them. So that's kind of how the process works there. I have been on rare disease projects though, where there are like 5 people in the world who know what that rare disease is. And so in that case, it's a matter of you doing the research and finding who the leading key opinion leader in that field is. So it kind of varies both ways. And then even at a large consulting firm, and then I know a lot of smaller consulting firms will do independent outreach because they don't have the budget in their projects for contracting out to those vendors. Other questions?
This is Maria. I have a question. So I'm new to learning about consulting, and I was told in previous sessions that life sciences consulting is considered more rigorous or involved, or there's like greater time commitment than some areas of consulting. And I'm curious to know like how in your experience that's played out, if that's true, if it's a large number of projects, or if it's travel, or what that looks like.
Yeah. Life sciences consulting firms typically don't travel, and some do, but typically not. And the reason behind that is because we have the ability of working on multiple projects at the same time. And so it doesn't make sense to travel to multiple clients within the same week. We'll travel for large like readouts, I guess, presentations, or if you, or senior people travel for like client meetings in person to build relationships and so on. So travel is kind of less so, there's less travel for this line of work. In terms of hours and lifestyle, so consulting, I think, generally gets a bad rep as being worse than pretty much everything else except for finance. And I think you can actually use that as a guide to understand which consulting projects are good and bad in terms of lifestyle. So if you're working for a finance company, like a private equity or venture capital firm, they will trickle their finance pressures and hours over to you. And those projects tend to be really intense, really painful, and not my cup of tea, at least. There are other projects, like your typical strategy projects, where it might be a high stress project for the client, and they might need something to inform a key decision that they're making the next month. So they need that input. That's high pressure. Then there's policy projects, which I like to stick to, and I've increasingly started to appreciate them for this, is that they're so forward looking that there's no pressure to do them immediately. And so I guess the less pressure there is from the client to get your project, the better of a lifestyle you'll have. If lifestyle is one of your key metrics that you're looking at jobs with. So in that sense, I used to work probably 55 hours a week at IQVIA, where I did more of the commercial strategy projects. Now I would do about 40 hours a week at CRA. So it's pretty typical, but I'll say that those 40 hours are like intense working 40 hours and not just kind of like hanging out, like mixed in, like interspersed with like, chill time and whatever. It is like 40 hours staring at my computer or like on calls or something. So it's intense, but it's rewarding at the same time. Other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. First off, it was really informative and definitely gave a really good overview that I feel like other info sessions may not touch on as much. What did your recruiting timeline look like? When did you start really considering CRA, and when did that whole thing play out last year?
Yeah. So I'll answer that question, then get into some of the recruiting stuff in a second. So the typical recruiting timeline is recruiting in the fall, so now. And what typically happens is, and I think this is kind of where MPH programs have a disadvantage compared to your typical other master's programs that have multiple years. So because the MPH and similar programs at Hopkins are only a year long, that means you basically start school and you're applying to jobs. And it's a very tough timeline to kind of get on top of. But most recruiting typically occurs in the fall. There are different waves of recruiting within the fall. So CRA has already started doing its first wave of recruiting. It's going to do a second wave of recruiting in October and the last wave in November. And the way that it, the way that it typically works is a consulting firm will get a target headcount of say we need 80 people to join by next year in fall, right? And then it's their job in this fall to now recruit enough people to meet that timeline. What will happen is sometimes as the interviews go on in the fall, more of those spots are filled, fewer of those spots remain, and so it gets a little more difficult to get jobs further down the line. I got my job at CRA in June, and I started in July. So the very late timeline, and that's because I didn't realize I wanted to go back into consulting until a lot later. Yeah. So all that is to say, the typical recruiting timeline is now-ish. So I would recommend starting to, it's literally a cover letter and a resume and your transcript. If you can send those three things to different companies and knock out 30 consulting firms that you're really interested in, you have pretty much done all the work. From there on, it's just a matter of who gets back to you and luck of the draw. So I'll say that much. There are also, depending on what level you're coming in from, there are ongoing recruitment for people coming in at higher levels. So, and I'll get into this right here. So most consulting firms have a trajectory that's similar to this. So at CRA, we call, and the names change of the positions, but you start, the most entry level position is as an analyst, And typically that's people coming out of undergrad or people with some work experience, but never consulting experience. An associate is someone who essentially does the same job as an analyst, gets paid a little bit more, but typically comes out of a master's program in public health or a master's in science or something like of that sort, or has a few years of consulting like experience or comparable like relevant experience. The consulting associate level is for someone typically coming out of an MBA, or if you're coming out of an MPH or a similar master's program with some experience. So more experience than I had. So I had about 1.5 years plus an MPH, and I went in as an associate. I was probably a more qualified associate than most, but that's to give you a rough estimate. Then the senior associate is more like your PhD or your doctoral student or someone with an MBA or an MPH with substantial experience that's relevant. Because the reason why is because senior associate is the next step away from being at the associate principal and principal level. And at those levels, you're really depending on your relationships in the industry to start selling work. So this is a little bit of the trajectory. You start as an analyst or associate and you work your way up. And then as this is relevant for recruiting, the analyst and associate positions are typically the first to fill up because undergraduate recruiting also coincides with them, which makes it a little trickier, but at the end of the day, it's just a matter of putting your application in. The consulting associate and the senior associate levels, there is more regular as needed recruiting throughout the year. That said, if you're a qualified person and you're coming in late, they may still interview you and still take you off cycle because they still want talent. Sorry if that was a long answer, but I hope that gives some context as to the complexities of the recruiting timeline. And that was general to most consulting firms, not just CRA. Okay, other questions? Yes, Miriam.
So in the analyst associate positions, then they have like these subcategories of, like risk investigation analytics or data analyst, or so what would somebody with a not medical background or not business background go for then?
It'd still be like if you have just a master's degree or a graduate degree, and sorry, if you have a graduate degree that is not an MBA or not a PhD, then you would most likely start at the analyst associate level anyways. So if that answers your question, it doesn't matter what your business background is. It matters more of like your general experience or even work experience before. Sorry, it matters more of like what education level you're coming out of, roughly how much experience you've had. So you'd probably end up going for those same roles anyways.
In the policy work that you do, is it all US policy focused, or I think you mentioned that one of your mentors was working on global policy as well. So how, like in terms of global policy, is it like any focus on low and middle income countries, or like what does it look like?
Yeah, so for life science consulting, I'll be honest, for the most part, no. And the reason is because most life science companies expect to make like 75 to 80% or more of their revenue within the US and select European markets. And so if they're not going to make revenue in lower income or lower middle income markets, it's unlikely that they'll contract and pay a lot of money to a consultant to do research on those markets. That said, for the HIV vaccine project, I did get to do a lot of low and middle income countries. So if that's helpful context. The global, when I say global, it typically means other developed countries. Yeah, Irene.
Okay, thank you very much, Ashu. I think you've made things extremely relatable, and I really appreciate that. I do have a question with regards to, I'm so sorry, I'm getting a bus to school. I do have a question with regards to internationals. You know, there's an extra layer of complexity, and in terms of getting a company that's willing to sponsor your visa. So both for the, mainly for after work, after school. So I just wanted to know, what are your thoughts in that regard, how to navigate that? Thank you.
Yeah, as someone who hasn't had to navigate that, I can't provide the full level of complexities behind it. However, I will say consulting firms, pretty much everyone, like I would say 1 out of 4 people that I work with is not based from the US. And so that in mind, it seems like a pretty good industry where companies are likely to offer a sponsorship because they really value merit.
All right, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't want to butcher your name, but
It's Yawa. It's pronounced
Yawa. Okay, thank you.
Basically, I have 2 questions. The first question was, I remember you talking about how you left consulting at one point. If you don't mind sharing, what made you want to go back into the industry?
Yeah, great question. So I realized that consulting as a job it gave me the privilege of seeing what was cutting edge and to be able to change that. And I think that is really what I wanted to be doing. And at the end of the day, yeah, like the ethical stuff aside, like if I experience a situation where I thought something was unethical, I can go back now with the knowledge of how to deal with that and be the person that does things the right way. And so I think that was one of the reasons behind that. And also consulting, the growth is ridiculous. Like when I say that there's a set trajectory for you to grow, like this thing on the screen right here, it's like 2 years and up, 2 years and up, 2 years and up. Maybe as you start to hit the senior associate level, like 3 to 4 years and up. But like it is so quick, and the exposure is an incredible learning opportunity. So it really teaches you how to just work at the best level that you possibly can.
Okay. Thank you. My second question is, I don't know if there's a proper way to answer. I mean, of course, you're in the field, but what is like a day in the life? It seems like this is a field where it could be a hybrid or remote because given everything with COVID, many people are able to actually work remotely or in a hybrid setting, but also maybe you do work in the office. So I wanted to know, what is like a day in the life for someone in this type of field?
Sure. Right now, I work hybrid, and CRA's policy is hybrid, and I think most consulting firms are hybrid. And so that means 2 to 3 days in the week. And then we have like a core day, which we're supposed to go in for all together. That day happens to be today. I'm going to go into the office after this. And then as far as like the work that I do day in, day out. So for example, like I'm going to have so I have 3 projects that I'm on right now. I usually meet with the project, like have a meeting internally within the project team or a meeting facing clients. The internal meetings are probably once every 2 days for each project. External facing meetings can be once every week or once every 2 weeks. Then the work that's actually involved in that means I'm balancing 3 projects at the same time, which you can kind of think of it as 3 really hard classes at the same time, where you just have to like make time to get the work done. And the difference I would say about the working world versus classes is you can't just get a B or a C or like a lower letter grade than you would have liked. If you do bad, you're actually producing a worse quality product for someone who's paying you a lot of money. So in that regard, like there is more stakes to it, in which case there's more pressure to like really invest in getting it right, which means there's a lot of times where if something is taking you longer than expected across multiple projects, you might be up late working on it, just like you would be in school to try to get a better grade.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I know we have just a couple minutes left. I want to be respectful of your time, Ashu. I didn't know if you had anything else that you wanted to communicate with the group before we go.
Yeah. So I, just in case you're interested in applying to CRA, here is a link to apply. I can pass these along to you. Here, actually, let me see if I can copy paste it into the chat. Might be easier. If I can exit this. I'm going to stop my screen share.
Okay, sounds great. And if you want to send me anything to send out after the fact, I'm happy to do that as well.
Okay, great. But yeah, as you're applying, if you're applying to CRA, I would use this link. Feel free to contact me if you have further questions, or just want to chat about the experience or anything. I'm happy to do that. And then as you're applying, one thing, when you're writing your cover letter, make sure to mention that you've attended this sort of an info session or you've spoken to me or something like that, because when they're screening through thousands of cover letters, it is a helpful thing for someone to see and be like, okay, this person's genuinely interested. And I've just sent out the job board posting. This, this is the analyst or associate role. And don't be misled by the link title. It's for life sciences and energy. So you can also apply to it to specify that you're life sciences, because I guess that's most likely going to be your interest. And then what else? Yeah, I would recommend that you go onto the other link on this. Let me just pass that along as well. And that you can use to see all the types of jobs that are available at CRA. In case you're interested in a different team or a different level. But the first link is for the analyst associate role, because I figured most people out of an MSPH or an MPH will probably headed towards that direction.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Ashu, I just want to say thank you on behalf of all of us, because this was a fantastic presentation. You really went so far in depth, and I think it was really helpful for those that are considering life sciences and hopefully considering CRA too, specifically. So I just wanted to say thank you for taking the time today, and we just really appreciate it. And if students have any follow-up questions, they can reach out, and I will certainly be sending over the recording this afternoon, as well as like the PowerPoint if you want to share that too.
Great. And I'm gonna put in my my email in the chat as well in case someone wants to reach out. There we go.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you all. Thank you again, Ashu, and hope everyone has a great rest of the afternoon.
Yep. Take care, everyone. And
Okay.
get your applications in soon.
Yes.
Don't think too much about it. Just put it in.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.